Okay, it looks like everyone is joining in. Thank you everybody for joining us and welcome to the 11th presentation in the Virtual History Series presented by Baltimore Heritage and the Baltimore Architecture Foundation. This is Nathan Denny's, Associate Director of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation, speaking to you from my home in Woodbury. First, thank you to everyone who donated to be with us today. It's through your generous support that we're able to host these programs for free every week. And before we get started, I'd like to share our upcoming virtual history. On July 24th, we will be talking environmental justice with public artist Graham Carroll Allen and environmental activist Jennifer Coons. And we'll be taking a look at the expressways that divide communities around Druid Hill Park and the effect of those expressways on the environment. And now, today's presentation. Anne Bruder is an architectural historian. Her interests in 20th century events, travel, and the built environment come together in her research of the Green Book. She is the author of Playing and Staying Along Maryland's Highways, which is the poster presentation regarding buildings in 11 states that are listed in the Green Book, and a contributor to the Green Book overview poster. You will find it handy. And before we get started, just a word of announcement here. Please add any questions you have for Anne in the Zoom chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of Anne's presentation. With that, take it away, Anne.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. All right. All right, while that's loading up, Nathan and John's asked me to say a few words about how I came to be interested in the Green Book and start doing the research. So my book club read Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, I think in 2013, and that mentioned the Green Book and a doctor who traveled from Louisiana to California. And I wondered then how many, if there were any sites in Maryland that were listed in the Green Book. And then in 2016, my colleague, Catherine Ziff, wrote an article for the Providence Journal about the Marie Wells Beauty Salon on Benefit Street, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But that started us talking about the Green Book, and we decided we would do some investigation, and maybe we could do a presentation at one of the upcoming conferences. And all of a sudden we had a project going on, and to the extent now that we have about 15 or 20 states that have been where investigations have been started. So with that, let me get to my presentation. When Victor and Alma Green, seen here at the top of the screen in 1962, produced the second edition of the Negro Motorist Green Book, in 1938, they made changes to the format that would be used for subsequent editions until the final publication in 1967. The Greens expanded the coverage to include 21 states, and here on the left, I've highlighted some of the northern states that were listed in the Green Book, because more African Americans were regularly traveling. New Jersey had 600 Green Book listings, and these are examples from California, Ohio. This is Columbus, Ohio on the left, and Cincinnati, the Mance Hotel Annex on the right. And the yellow house on the left is the Marie Wells Beauty Salon, and Benefit Street has undergone gentrification since the 1930s, and that's what the house looks like now. And then a hotel in Newport. Every state had some form of segregation, and travelers needed information about places where they would be treated with dignity when traveling. Throughout the Green Book's publication, a total of 26 towns with 101 sites were listed for Maryland, with 54 sites in Baltimore, which had the state's largest African-American population and most frequently attracted out-of-towners. Many have fallen on hard times, are known only through postcards or interpretive panels, and this is the Sugarland Tavern at Druid Hill Avenue and the Blue Jay Motel down in Waldorf, and I'll be talking about that building in a little bit. but statewide 26 buildings still stand. These buildings are part of Maryland's mid-20th century African-American cultural landscape in Baltimore, Hagerstown, Frederick, Shadyside, Waldorf, Faulkner, and Colton. And those are the sites I'll be talking about. Historian David Taft Terry defines this period as a time of struggle for rights and recognition. All of the buildings listed in the Green Book were used by people who sought respite from the spatial and cultural limits that the Jim Crow era placed on them. Between November 1st, 1864, when slavery was abolished in Maryland, until May 18th, 1896, when Plessy versus Ferguson was decided by the Supreme Court, African Americans had periods of relative freedom as well as times of restriction. By 1875, it had become fashionable to travel for leisure, and African Americans who had time and money began to take steamer excursions to Bayside towns such as Easton and Pasadena, and this is a 1912 ad from the Afro-American. But as a result of the Plessy decision, Maryland continued to enact segregation laws. Until the third quarter of the 20th century, these laws affected African American accommodations in travel, education, housing, and recreation. The need for guides grew as more people chose to travel by car, and all of the Green Book sites were accessible by car. In Maryland by 1910, there were 468,500 cars registered in the state, and by 1940, there were over 32 million registered cars, buses, and trucks. And I don't have a breakdown by ethnic group, but it's still a lot of traffic. A dozen travel guides are known, including Baltimore's Afro-American newspaper. Each guide's information varied to appeal to different customers, but generally they provided information about a state's towns where services were available. This included tourist homes, hotels, restaurants, and taverns, nightclubs, and in Maryland, a country club, a pharmacy, and campgrounds. In 1940, the Afro-American expanded the social column with a new travel feature written by Ida Murphy Smith that discussed travel to places such as Atlantic City and New York. After the US entered World War II, in 1942, the Afro-American began selling a travel map, seen here on the left, that copied listings from the Green Book to help travelers since the Green Book ceased publication during the war. Travel remained an important feature for the newspaper, and in 1952, the newspaper developed a travel bureau overseen by editor Melvina Jackson. The Afro-American's weekly publication allowed it to give travel advice, and the service was similar to the AAA services, which were not available to African Americans until the late 1950s. While the Green Book provided general travel advice and its own travel services, it was particularly useful on a day-to-day basis to consult about local services. The Green Book did not require characteristic architectural forms that would identify the listed buildings. Rather, such listings showed that the owner was known in the community and that the business would welcome travelers. Propriety was also important. The women who ran tourist homes listed themselves using the title Mrs., usually followed by their husband's first and last names. There are a couple of exceptions to the rule in Maryland, as I will explain, starting in Baltimore. Baltimore's Green Book listings include Mrs. E. Watson's tourist home, the Druid Hill YMCA from 1916, seen here, and the 1944 Madison Street YWCA, as well as the Monumental City Club, a local golf group. The Monumental City Club advertised in the Green Book in 1940 and 1941 when the club's president, Dallas Nicholas, a lawyer, tried to drum up interest to improve the Carroll Park golf course, since the greens were said to be in sandy condition. Carroll Park is one of the city's 5 public golf courses in southwest Baltimore, and until the 1950s, the only one in the city regularly open to African Americans. Starting in 1934, African Americans were allowed to play at Carroll Park on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and alternate Sundays. The golf course itself was not a Green Book listing. Nicholas sued the city using the same separate but equal arguments that Thurgood Marshall made in the 1930s for the Maryland teachers' pay cases that he prosecuted, claiming that the Parks Department should make the golf course equal to the whites-only courses. Willie Mae Jackson considered the suit frivolous, but Nicholas succeeded in getting improvements. Druid Hill Avenue has been home to many members of Baltimore's middle class African American community, and the placement of the African American Ys in the neighborhood between 1902 and 1944 underscores how important they were to the community. Many towns and cities listed their Ys in the Green Book, and it was frequently the first place a newcomer would go to get a room. The YWCA opened its second building on Madison Street in Druid Hill in 1944. Architect Albert Irvin Cassell, who designed buildings at Morgan and Howard universities and was also a Baltimore native, provided plans to update the building, which had previously served as the Baltimore Hebrew Congregation Synagogue House. Kathleen, I want to talk to you about the condition of these plan sheets, and I'll come back to that. The YWCA raised $100,000 between 1942 and 1944 in order to renovate the building and house up to 20 permanent residents and 18 transient guests. During World War II, when people worked around the clock and beds were shared in shifts, a single bed in a shared room was a luxury. The use of the former Jewish facility demonstrates how the neighborhood was changing from the 1930s through the 1950s as African Americans acquired buildings from whites who were moving to Northwest Baltimore. The building has since been converted to condominiums. Mrs. E. Watson's tourist home appeared in the Green Book between 1947 and 1953, and 47 is the first year that the Green Book started publication after the war. The Bellevue, a large pre-war apartment building from 1910 on Bloom Street, shows an urban form that the tourist home took. During World War II, when the YWCA residence halls were full, neighborhood women would offer a room or a bed in nearby apartments and houses. Mrs. Watson seems to have been one of those women, and she continued to offer her hospitality after the war ended. Her given name was Etta, and the listing using the woman's first initial as Mrs. E. Watson seems to designate a widow. So she was still respectable, but there was no husband. 3 Frederick women, who were the contacts for tourist homes between 1938 and 1967, demonstrate the large role women played in the Green Book's hospitality industry. Mrs. E. Greenwich, seen here on the left, Mrs. William Roberts, not seen here, I'm afraid I don't have a picture of her, and Mrs. John Makel, seen on the right, ran boarding houses in the 1930s when they listed them as Green Book tourist homes. Frederick is an example of a small community that lacked a hotel where African Americans could stay, and so they depended on boarding houses to provide lodging. The the 1940 census identifies Ada Roberts as the boarding house manager at 316 West South Street in Frederick. According to the Frederick City land records, her husband William came into possession of the South Street parcel in 1894. The two-story house has been altered with the addition of the mansard roof attic and those 2 front gables. And the west stair hall seen here, appears to be an addition, but it may once have been an exterior fire escape. Before 1940, teachers were frequent boarders in the houses along All Saints and South Streets because of their low pay. The late 1930s Frederick City directories and the 1940 census listed 4 teachers as living at Mrs. Roberts' tourist home. After World War II, teachers did not board at the tourist home, which suggests that teachers' pay had improved since the late 1930s. William H.B. Greenwich, a photographer and artist, purchased the early 19th century row house at 22 West All Saints Street in 1920. And his photo studio was in the first floor, and this, I hope you can see my arrow, the air conditioner and the barbershop sign is where his studio was. Although William died in 1925, his wife Esther remained on All Saints Street and opened her house to boarders as well as to Green Book visitors as the Mrs. E. Greenwich Tourist Home. Greenwich was a 4th grade teacher at the 7th Street School. She also founded the African American Kindergarten in Frederick in 1937. The Green Book carried a listing for the Greenwich Tourist Home in 1948, but the name was changed to E. Greenwich Tourist Home to reflect Greenwich's death in 1947. In Frederick's uptown African American neighborhood, Mrs. Emma Makel lived at 119 East 5th Street in the house she purchased with her husband John in 1908. And it's next door, just past these trees, is the Laboring Sons Cemetery, and so it was next door to that. The Makel House is one of Frederick's double houses and displays the Gothic Revival dormers, seen here, and a traditional Western Maryland form, the open passage way on the 2nd floor, and it also includes passage on the ground floor. And it's lovely in the summer. It lets a cool breeze in, and it does the same thing in the winter when it's frigid. So it's not always a popular selection. Mrs. Makel sold the house in 1947, but it remained a Green Book tourist home listing until 1967. The Harmon Hotel stood at 226 North Jonathan Street in Hagerstown, and it is a late 19th century commercial building. Walter Harmon was a large property owner, and he was a barber, a saloon keeper, as well as a hotel keeper. So he was quite a busy man, and he had 10 children, so including the hotel. A drawing of the building shows a 3-story, 5-bay building with a mansard roof and 3 entrances. Perhaps the most notable guest who stayed was baseball player Willie Mays, who came to Harmon's when he could not stay in Hagerstown's White Hotel with his teammates. In 1950s, Mays played his first professional game in Hagerstown with the Trenton Giants, the farm team for the then New York Giants. That was before they became the San Francisco Giants. And they played against the Boston Braves farm team, which, as I say, in Hagerstown. Other frequent travelers included Negro Baseball League teams such as the Baltimore Elite Giants and musicians such as Duke Ellington, who also required housing when traveling. And I want to point out, this is the Astor Hotel in Jacksonville, Florida, and the sign says colored. We do know that Duke Ellington played at the Hill. He played in many places in Maryland, but in 1953, he played at the Hilltop Inn in Capitol Heights on Central Avenue, and it was one of the first times, I think, that the term rock and roll was ever used. In a town about 20 miles south of Annapolis, Mrs. M. Carter is listed in the vacation section of the 1938-1939 Green Books in Shadyside, Anne Arundel County, without specifying whether she ran a tourist home or a hotel. Mattiel Dennis Carter used a house called Shady Rest at the corner of Shady Rest and Shadyside Roads as a tourist home. She was married to James Carter, who was the Morgan State College business manager. Carter's connection with Morgan College and the many visiting teachers, as reported by the Afro's Afro-American social columns emphasizes the links between Baltimore and Shadyside. The two-story house is one of those buildings that have had many changes. But as the photo shows, it's a double pile, and you can see that the double pile means that there are two sets of windows on the side. A double from at least the late 19th century, with front gable dormers and varied window placement. In 1949, Mrs. Carter appeared a last time in the Green Book's vacation guide, which was different from just the traveler's guide. That year, she bought the house that her parents had owned on Parish Creek at the corner of Atwell Road. Carter's houses are one of 7 or 8 Shadyside tourist homes that were advertised in the Afro-American between 1902 and 1949, when the town seems to have faded as a summer resort as nearby towns became more popular. Several hotels in Charles and St. Mary's counties benefited from the construction of the Robert Crain Highway, seen here in 1930. Between 1922 and 1927, as well as the improvements the State Roads Commission made to create US 301 in the 1950s. The road connected Charles County and thus the roads in St. Mary's County to Baltimore. John and Mary Golden owned the hotel called Goldmans in Colton, which was listed in the Green Book in 1939 with no advertising during World War II, and then again from 1947 to 1949, and then finally in 1953. The resort consisted of a main house of 2 stories with 7 bays beneath a cross-gable metal roof, and it has a side hall entrance. The hotel also had cabins where guests could stay, and the Afro-American social columns highlighted activities at Golden's during the 1920s and 1930s, when middle-class professional, religious, and social groups from Washington, D.C. made annual outings, including baseball, crabbing, fishing, and swimming. Some guests who could afford to stay longer were described as summering at Goldens, while other guests motored on Maryland's highways from Washington to the hotel. The advantage of using a hotel for vacation was that the maintenance costs did not fall to the visitor. Following the death of owner Mrs. Mary Golden in 1945, Harry and Mildred Graves purchased the property in 1946. In 1953, the Graves undertook an advertising campaign using photos by Washington, D.C. photographer Robert H. McNeil, but they did not list in the Green Book after that year. One issue was certainly the discrimination that guests faced when visiting. As an example of segregation of spatial and cultural limits, visitors could sail in St. Patrick's Creek, as you see here, but they were told they could not visit Coltons Point post office. And the listing is not Coltons Point, it's Colton. And I think that was Green's way of distinguishing where in the community you would be allowed to go. As the 1950s highway improvements occurred, enterprising owners constructed 2 motels on US 301, the Blue Star, seen here on the left, and the Blue Jay Motel in Waldorf, seen here on the right. Both have been demolished as a result of Charles County's burgeoning development. Construction of the Blue Jay occurred in 1952. US 301 was put on an alignment to the west of Waldorf that removed Arthur Farrar's Blue Jay baseball stadium, but he used the money he received to build a motel on the west side of the new highway. The motel was a 1-story L-shaped structure with a gable roof. Mr. Farrar came to Waldorf from Washington, D.C., although he's originally from North Carolina, in the late 1930s, bought land and built a gas station, sandwich shop, and the baseball stadium before going into the hotel business, although he maintained his other businesses as well until the end of his life. The Blue Star Motel in Faulkner is 6 miles from the Nice Bridge and was first listed in the 1958 Green Book. And a 1958 deed references a 1953 plan for the motel by A.N. Siroff, P.E., who was a New York civil engineer / architect. He sort of seemed to, depending on what he was doing, he would call himself an engineer or he would be an architect, who worked for motel developers who were building motels along major highways for various chains. The flat roof and window monitors at the top of the wall suggest that Siroff had a modernist bent, since this motel was not for a particular chain. It was just, it was for developers in Charles County. And I think that some of the county officials were very dubious about African Americans developing motels. But so the extant Green Book buildings reflect some of Maryland's built history and explain how African Americans use them. While it is clear that African American travel occurred before the Green Book's 1937 publication, the 90-year period between freedom and civil rights is infrequently considered beyond scholarly circles. But a study of the Green Book sites and knowing the communities that produce the cultural landscape will help all of us understand just how long Americans of African descent have struggled for their rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was a fantastic presentation. And again, everybody, if you have questions for Anne, please type them in the chat box and we will, I'll verbalize those to you and answer. And we have a few in here. One person was asking about resources available for viewers. Anne has compiled a wonderful bibliography with some great books on it, which will be circulating around after the presentation to everyone who registered. Next question I have is from Marie, who's asking, what was the name of the photo studio in Frederick that you showed?
It was the William Greenwich. It was William Greenwich's photo studio. I don't know that. Well, I don't know that he was necessarily listed as. I mean, he was a professional photographer, but I don't know that he necessarily had a sign on the shop that said photographer.
Okay, the next question I have is, are there enough structures left in Baltimore to have a real life tour?
I think so. There's certainly, you can see the buildings, but one of the things, Candace Taylor, who is African American, and she's just published a book called The Overground Road, and it's all about the Green Book, came to Maryland, and she had come from California. I think she was a little disappointed to discover there weren't any bright lights and wonderful jazzy places to go. And many of them have fallen on hard times, but they're certainly there. And I went last summer with Megan Bako from the Preservation Maryland and her intern Joseph, and we walked Pennsylvania Avenue, and there's plenty to see. It would probably take some planning, but I'd be game.
Well, maybe after the pandemic is over, we could do like a bus tour and go around town to check out some of these sites. It's really fascinating. The next question we have is, did AAA end up giving Green Book locations eventually?
Yes. If I meant to point that out, the Blue Star Motel, their sign had the AAA logo at the bottom. So by the late 1950s, and I've been told that I think it was about 1955 or 57, AAA started offering services to African Americans.
Next question we have is, when Green Book stopped publishing during World War II, did they begin again after the war?
Yes, they started publication in 1947. The reason, paper and ink were among the rationed items, and no one was traveling. So the Afro-American newspaper had better access to ink and to paper, and that's why they printed the map so that people could use it. And I assume, although I should probably try to find somebody from Los Angeles that or even Chicago, that somebody, one of the African American newspapers in one of those cities might have done a similar map for the western half of the country.
All right. Next question we have is, were any of the Green Book sites targeted by local racist groups?
Not that I am aware of. Although, the question is actually, the way that question is actually has been asked in the past is, why aren't there more sites listed? Because everyone knows about hotels or beaches in, like Henry's Beach down in Crisfield, or, clubs in Chestertown, or a hotel, a hotel in Montgomery County. And I think some of that has to do with the overall atmosphere of how strong the racist sentiment was. The Klan was active, and they weren't shy about showing their displeasure when, or trying to be difficult when they felt like it. So, and one of the things to remember is that in 1931 and 1933, the last two lynchings in Maryland occurred in Salisbury and Princess Anne. And so for a long time, the only hotel, or actually the only lodging that was listed in Salisbury was the, I've forgotten what the name of it is. It was a tourist home. And then in the mid 1950s, the Franklin Hotel opened in Salisbury, and there was a restaurant listed starting again in the 1950s for Princess Anne. But there was a certain amount of just, we don't need a lot of strangers coming in, and if you look, and I didn't point this out necessarily, but US 40 going from Delaware down to Baltimore, and then from Baltimore out to Cumberland, and US 301 going south, are sort of the ways you're being directed through the state if you're traveling through. If you're stopping, you're welcome to come. You're welcome to go other places, but you definitely should know where you were going.
Okay, the next question we have is, will this presentation be available for viewing / sharing? Yes, we'll be uploading the presentation to YouTube later today. And if it's not ready today, it'll be ready to share probably early next week. Next question we have is, could existing structures be honored with plaques or signage for their Green Book designation?
They could be, although it's important, it's funny, people have asked about the African American Museum in Washington, and they have a car that shows a little clip of people driving, and people have been surprised that it's such a little exhibit. But it's important to remember that it was just an aspect of life in the mid-century. It wasn't really, you know, I don't know how to just, it wasn't the most important thing. I mean, a lot of people are traveling, but not everybody traveled. And um, so, so I don't know, in and of itself, a listing in the Green Book is not, going to make it eligible for the National Register. It's an interesting aspect of its historicity, but um, it's going to be more about what what the history of the community is like.
Right. This is an interesting question. Uh, so it's about how the Green Book listed things. It says, did the location owners request or pay to have their places listed in the Green Book, or is it based purely on traveler recommendations?
Um, Victor Green was said to have visited all 50 states and identified buildings or businesses to list. And getting, as you read through it, and you need to read from year to year to sort of understand how the listings change, because they do change. And um, you if all it said was Mrs. E. Greenwich tourist home, well, actually what they would do is they would have a listing. It would say Frederick and then tourist home and then list Mrs. E. Greenwich, um, Mrs. J. Makel, and Mrs. R. whatever. The Franklin Hotel in Salisbury was in about 1960 was the only hotel in any of the Green Book listings for Maryland that had a display ad. And you did have to pay for the display ad, but if you stayed at a place and thought it was nice, you could call up or actually write a letter um, to the Green Book editorial office. And one of the things I didn't mention, um, Mrs. the uh, Mrs. Watson's tourist home on Bloom Street. In the Green Book, it was listed as BLUM, and it took me a while to figure out that it was supposed to be BLOOM. So, but that's sort of what happened. That people would be, they would say the name as they had heard it. And I know, for instance, that. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm reading a note from one of the attendees. Um, the I'm sorry. Now I've gotten totally distracted. Um, what was the question again?
Oh, the question, I think you answered it, was about like if people paid for listings. So you were saying that if people would pay for like the picture ads in there, but a listing
Yeah,
wasn't really based on like a pay to play type
yeah.
thing.
And what I started to say was up in Newport, Catherine Ziff has found a house that was listed as Ma Gruber's tourist home. And there was no one there by the name of Gruber. It was Magruder. But just in the course of the business, it got, or somewhere in the translation, it got a little mangled. But people would know where to go when they needed to get there.
Yeah, and we got a comment about the markers for Green Book sites. So Kelly here is saying that the African American Civil Rights Network at the National Park Service is eager to add Green Book sites to the list of network sites.
Hmm.
There's a link here in the chat box if anyone's interested in learning about that project. I'll take a couple more questions, I think. Here's one that's asking, were Sparrows Beach and Carr's Beach listed in the Green Book? These beach facilities near Annapolis were run by a pair of sisters.
Yes, they were listed, and I do have photos or postcards about them. You know, what you've got here is sort of what my research has let me do. I have a full-time 40-hour a week job and family responsibilities and life in general. So I need to get onto it. I need, to make some trips. I have to go up to Westminster to find Austin Scarlett's country club, which I know the road, but I haven't figured out where exactly on that road it is, but it isn't a very long road, so I think that should be okay. And I need to get down to Salisbury and a couple of other places on the Eastern Shore to find those. And I've never stopped. I have to go, and then I have to go all the way to Cumberland to find the one listing that was in Cumberland. So I have some work to do. But if anybody out there is related or has any association with the post office, I have a question about rural routes and identifying an address, because one of the only Chestertown listing is for something called Bailey's Acres, and it's on Rural Route 2 and is box 90. And I don't know how to identify box 90. And do I just go out? I know Rural Route 2 is actually Maryland Route 20. So do I just go out drive out there and count till I get to 90 mailboxes, or is there some system? And neither the National Archives or the Post Office Museum seem to be able to answer that question. So.
All right, well, maybe there'll be someone here who can help you out with that. So we'll get to two more questions. Next one is, how much did the Green Book cost? Who published it, and where would you go to find one if you're looking for one?
It started out at about 25 cents a copy, and by the end it was $1. And the Esso gas stations sold it or carried them, and you were supposed to be able to get service from an Esso station. And I think it sort of varied depending on the owner and how tolerant they were of African American customers.
And the last question I have here is, were any of the more recent hotels multiracial where whites and blacks were able to stay together?
Not in Baltimore that I am aware of. I do know that the hotel in Providence, and I've forgotten the name already, and one of the hotels and the hotel in Cincinnati, the Manse, were supposed to be multiracial. I'm not, and I know that the one in Cincinnati, well, actually, I know that both in Cincinnati and in Providence, both African Americans and whites stayed in those, but those were big motels and with lots of people coming and going.
Okay, well, thank you, Anne. That is our time for today. And thank you, everyone, for attending and all the thoughtful discussion and the chat. Like I said earlier, we'll be sending around the bibliography that Anne has put together of books about Green Book sites and various research on the topic. And we'll also be posting a recording of this presentation on the AIA Baltimore and Baltimore Architecture Foundation YouTube page. So again, thank you very much and have a wonderful weekend.
Okay, thank you. Nathan, is the chat going to be available as well? Is that going to be, is that recorded, or is that just?
Yeah, I'll have an archive of it, so I can send that to you. I think there's a lot of stuff in here that you might,
yeah,
you might be interested in.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Holding up a copy of the Green Book. Hi, Sally.
Oh, good. Yeah, there are copies at the, oh, those are the real deal copies. Wow. Okay, I would be happy to talk to her.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.